My name is Frederick Brown. I'm the Deputy Executive Director with Learning Forward, and I'd like to welcome you to this next Thought Leader Lecture. This is a very unique lecture because, as you know, by the fact that you're in this room, we're introducing something to the U.S. that's never existed. So we're very excited about this Thought Leader Lecture on our set of Principal Supervisor Standards. So I'm going to turn this over to Nicholas Pelzer from the Wallace Foundation, who will offer some introductory remarks on behalf of Wallace. And then we'll turn it over to Mary Canole, who will lead this panel discussion. So at this time, Nicholas from the Wallace Foundation.
Good morning. I heard nothing back, Fred. One more time. Good morning. Thank you. I'm feeling the love. The Wallace Foundation has been working with states and school districts on better ways to train, hire, support, and evaluate principals for nearly 15 years. We supported the development of the 2015 Model Principal Supervisor Standards as part of our long-term commitment to develop and share knowledge, ideas, and insights aimed at increasing understanding of how education leadership can contribute to improved student learning. Now today, principals face new pressures to improve student learning while also implementing new academic standards. They urgently need better support so they can become the instructional leaders and change agents that we need. Now, traditionally, the role of the principal supervisor has focused on ensuring that school leaders complied with district policies and state regulations. A Wallace Commission study by the Council of the Great City Schools found that principal supervisors are often stretched for time, insufficiently trained, poorly matched to the needs of their schools, and assigned too many principals to support. Emerging research suggests that principal supervisors can boost student achievement if they shift their role and their work toward hiring principals and helping them grow as instructional leaders. But principal supervisors are often not empowered to do this new work. They may spend most of their time dealing with district bureaucracy. They manage dozens of principals, and they dilute their impact because of it. Further, there is no national consistency across school districts about the title or the role. Many are not trained for an instructionally focused job. And while most are former principals, the skills to run a building are not the same as the skills needed to coach and mentor other principals to lead instruction. It was clear that standards for the role of principal supervisor were needed. The new voluntary model principal supervisor standards provide a clear, practical definition of what principal supervisors should know and be able to do. The standards highlight the necessity of principal supervisors to dedicate their time to coach and support principals. The students highlight the necessity of principal supervisors to engage in effective professional learning strategies to help principals grow as instructional leaders. Under the leadership of the Council of Chief State School Officers, a 12-person committee of educators worked on the principal supervisor standards for over a year. They are standards grounded in newly refreshed standards for school leaders known as the 2015 Professional Standards for Education Leaders. With that, please join me in welcoming Mary Canole, Council of Chief State School Officers.
Thanks, Nicholas. And first and foremost, I want to appreciate so much the research and the ongoing support of the Wallace Foundation over the last 15 years. I'm sure we would not get to the point where we all know and understand that leadership matters without their strong effort. So thank you for that. This session is going to be a whirlwind tour of the standards by virtue of PowerPoint. And then I'm going to turn to my colleagues here on the panel. I'd like to introduce first and foremost Janiece Harris. She is an instructional superintendent for the school district in DC, and she actually serves as a principal supervisor. As Nicholas pointed out, the names for principal supervisors across districts are varied. A principal supervisor in one district may be an instructional superintendent in another and have a completely different name somewhere else. With Janiece is her supervisor, and that is Amanda Alexander, the Deputy Chief of Schools for DC Schools. And Amanda actually supervises 6 instructional superintendents in her work. And then finally, we have Ben Fenton. Ben is one of the co-founders of New Leaders organization, and he also serves as their Chief Strategy Officer. Ben's organization has been in the business of preparing both principals and principal supervisors, so he brings a unique perspective to this conversation today. So let me go through the components of the standards, and then we're going to shift to a panel discussion where we can get into looking at the work on the ground in practice. So with that, let me share that Nicholas has said some of the things, so I won't need to cover them, but I think first and foremost, we all know that effective leadership is essential. And it's because of its link to student performance, it's because that it is second only to teaching as a strategy that contributes to student achievement. And finally, we have no documented instances of turning around failing schools without a powerful leader on board. So what's our vision for principal supervisors? First and foremost, it's different than what appears to be the managerial function of principal supervisors in most districts across the country today. But we want principal supervisors to be district leaders who support principals in their work, in their schools. We want them to spend most of their time coaching principals so that they build principals' instructional leadership capacity. We also want them to work to create schools that are culturally and socially responsive and have equitable access to resources. And then finally, so importantly, we want principal supervisors to lead strategic change efforts, both in the schools with those principals, but also in the districts, so that all programs are the highest quality. So why do we need principal supervisor standards? Well, Nicholas pointed out that right now principals are under an awful lot of pressure. They are being held accountable for the performance, the high performance of every single student that comes into their schools. And without that performance, they're likely to lose their job. What we find is that principal supervisors can be the support vehicle for these principals if, in fact, they focus on the right actions. And today's principal supervisors, unfortunately, are kind of pigeonholed into job descriptions that make them focus on compliance and regulation versus engaging in the important work that really can shift principals' practice and make it so much more effective. The model standards are going to help districts ensure that principal supervisors focus on the work that matters. So what are these? Model principal supervisor professional standards. As Nicholas said, they're the first time ever, or I guess as Fred said when he started out, first ever standards for principal supervisors. It's important to note that they're voluntary and adaptable. As a matter of fact, they're worth nothing unless a district or a state takes them and absorbs them into their own individual context. There are certain districts that the only principal supervisor in that district is the superintendent. In small districts, superintendents don't have a lot of capacity in central office, so they are juggling this particular role of supporting principals along with the myriad of other responsibilities that they have. These provide a really great description of what principal supervisors need to know and be able to do in order to effectively support principals and grow their instructional leadership practice. And they are a product of a 12-member work committee that, in my eyes, I got to facilitate them, was second to none. And I want to point out that Fred Brown was a member of that particular, this particular work group, as was Ben Fenton. And the leader of our group is in the room right now, and that's Dave Volrath from Department of Ed in Maryland. So Dave, if you want to wave for a second. Okay. So, and the other thing, as Nicholas pointed out, these are grounded in the new Professional Standards for Educational Leaders 2015. These two sets of standards are made to work together. So let's look at the slide that's up there right now. Grounding the development of our standards was a theory of action that was based on a question that the Wallace Foundation posed a couple of years back in regard to gaps in the research about the effectiveness of both principal supervisor and principal practice. So our guiding theory of action, this is what we believe will happen, and it still needs to be proven, obviously, but this is where we're heading. If principal supervisors shift from focusing on compliance to shaping principals' instructional leadership capabilities, and if they're provided with the right training, support, and number of principals to supervise, then the instructional leadership capacity of the principals with whom they work will improve and result in effective instruction and the highest levels of student learning and achievement. So, as our work group thought it was so important to have a theory of action to serve as an underpinning for the standards, we also felt it was absolutely essential to define this notion of instructional leadership. And it had been defined way back in the 1980s by an educator researcher by the name of Wynne de Beauvois. And his definition stated that these are the actions, instructional leadership are the actions that principals take or delegate to others to promote growth in student learning. Unfortunately, at the time, it was narrowly interpreted to mean such things as classroom observations, teacher evaluation, feedback, and coaching, which are all definitely instrumental in the role of instructional leader. But we felt it was broader than that. And if you look up on your screen right now, you're going to see that we ensure that our definition of instructional leadership also encompasses such actions as modeling learning for others, being the lead learner, confronting issues of equity that impede student learning, recognizing and responding to cultural and learning needs of students, increasing the capacity of staff to improve student learning, making decisions based on how they affect kids and their learning, understanding the systems that affect student success, and finally, sharing and distributing responsibilities for student learning. If you take away one thing from this slide, I want you to see that all of these actions are very student-centric. And if you look at the new 2015 Professional Standards for Educational Leaders, you will see that all of their standards are focused on students and also are student-centric. So where did we get the influence for our principal supervisor standards? Well, we had two influences. We had feedback from practitioners. We did, probably 9 months of surveying and focus groups of not only principal supervisors, but principals, central office leaders, professional educational leadership organizations, and State Department of Ed. We also had the good fortune of having Meredith Honig, a researcher from the University of Washington, serve on our development team. And we are very much aligned with their research finding that principal supervisors matter to improve student learning by working through principals and teachers, and specifically by helping principals grow as instructional leaders. So what does this mean? Well, it's a huge shift for the field. We're asking principal supervisors that in most districts today, unless they're working with the Wallace Foundation or New Leaders or University of Washington perhaps, They are in a compliance role, and we're asking them to shift to a support role, the role of coach for a principal. And the principal supervisors need to spend significant time with principals in their schools. And unfortunately, right now, they don't have the necessary structures in place to be able to do that work effectively. So we're asking central offices to redesign themselves. So in fact, that they are supporting the work of principal supervisors so they can support principals, and principals can support teachers, and of course teachers can support the learning of students. So it's all of this ongoing reciprocal relationship that takes place throughout the system. And finally, I think one more thing to think about with these standards is that they shouldn't be interpreted as a job description or an assessment tool necessarily for principal supervisors, because what you're going to find is that these are aspirational standards. The standards will inform job descriptions and assessment tools for principal supervisors, but basically they will serve as a continuum of practice for a principal supervisor. Most principal supervisors will not be ready to implement all of these standards right off the bat. It will take time. So now let's get into the standards, the whirlwind tour, and what I'd like to say first and foremost is that the document will be posted on the Learning Forward website. It is not in your app. And it is also going to live on the CCSSO site, and I'll give you those web addresses at the end of this short presentation. The standards, there are 8 of them, are meant to work together with each other. They're all integrated. Each standard is presented as a standard statement, which I will be showing you today, and also with it will be a short description of the standard. In addition, there is a list of dispositions that we feel all principal supervisors should have in order to be effective in their role. And then we have a set of actions that principal supervisors need to engage in if they are going to effectively reach the standard. What's important about the actions is that they are written in a sequence. They are written in a continuous improvement sequence where we start with actions pertaining to studying what needs to happen in the school, developing strategies to implementation of the strategy, and then an evaluation to determine whether or not the action got the result that we were looking for. So let's now look at the standards. The standards are divided into 3 categories, and 4 of the standards, the first 4, are part of the category under the name of educational leadership. Obviously, these first four standards speak to the focus of all of the principal supervisor standards on instructional leadership and building the capacity of the principal in that realm. Standard 1, principal supervisors dedicate their time to helping principals grow as instructional leaders. I'm not going to go into the actions. This is just a quick whet your appetite of the standards. Standard 2, principal supervisors coach and support individual principals and lead principals' communities of practice to help principals grow as instructional leaders. Not only does the principal supervisor work one-on-one with a principal, but they have the responsibility for facilitating professional learning communities for groups of principals, and thereby modeling to principals what they are expected to do with their community of learners in the school. Standard 3, principal supervisors use evidence of principals' effectiveness to determine necessary improvements in principals' practice, to foster a positive educational environment that supports the diverse cultural and learning needs of students. Everything that a principal supervisor does is based on the evidence of principal practice. And so that principal supervisor is zeroing in and tailoring their support to each principal. Standard 4, principal supervisors engage principals in the formal district principal evaluation process in ways that helps them grow as instructional leaders. Bottom line, yes, you make summative decisions with a a principal evaluation process, but the focus of the principal supervisor's work is to use this evaluation process as a tool to grow that principal's practice. The next category is district operations. It's up to the principal supervisor to also ensure the smooth and effective functioning of the district. Standard 5 is principal supervisors advocate for and inform the coherence and organizational vision, policies, and strategies to support schools and student learning. It's important to note that the principal supervisor plays a pivotal role. 1 foot in the school, 1 foot in the district. So it's not uncommon for the principal supervisor to see district policy not doing what it was intended to do in the schools itself. If it's not supporting the way it was intended, the principal supervisor will go back to the district. And because of that feedback, the district will make changes in strategies and policies and procedures. Standard 6, principal supervisors assist the district in ensuring the community of schools with which they are engaged are culturally and socially responsive and have equitable access to resources necessary for the success of each student. It's important to note that we have issues of equity are being addressed in each one of our standards, but we felt it was such important work, and we're really not there yet at all. We don't do an adequate job with our attention to equity, that we wanted to call it out in this Standard 6, much like the new professional standards for educational leaders called out this issue of equity. And then finally, the third category is all about district leadership. Standard 7, principal supervisors engage in their own development and continuous improvement to help principals grow as instructional leaders. The principal supervisor has that responsibility to grow themselves as well as their principals. Standard 8, principal supervisors lead strategic change that continuously elevates the performance of schools and sustains high-quality educational programs and opportunities across the district. We want excellent schools all across the district, not in a portfolio of schools that one principal supervisor may actually supervise, but every single school in the district. So with that, let me just share the website where you can find this document. It's www.ccsso.org. And again, it will also be on the Learning Forward website as well. But for now, I want to give special thanks to the Wallace Foundation for its support of this work. If you've ever worked with this foundation, you know how firmly they believe in the importance of school leadership, school and district leadership. And then finally, special thanks to those that served on the standards development team for the Principal Supervisor Standards. And in addition to all of these individuals, I would also like to thank CCSSO leadership. And I think perhaps in the room today, I know Holly Bofi is here. Mary Dean Behringer will be coming in, and also Janice Poda. So with that, we're going to shift out of this slideshow, and we are going to move to our distinguished panel to have some conversation with them. And I guess I'll play talk show host from here, seeing there's no chair over there. But I think I'd like to start with you, Amanda, and I'm going to ask one particular panelist to respond to a question, but then I'm going to ask the others to jump in. And we have a handful of questions for them, and at the end, we're going to have some time for all of you to ask your questions as well. But Amanda, you know, as a district leader, I'm going to ask you, how and why has the work of principal supervisors changed? You've been watching this for a while.
I have. Is this on? Yes, it is. The role of the principal supervisor has changed in the District of Columbia Public Schools because we realized that the focus on compliance was not getting us the results that we needed. We needed individuals who knew instruction, had the ability to go into a classroom, with a principal, diagnose instructional flaws, weaknesses, and then help the principal chart a course of action to address those deficiencies. That's very different than having a superintendent require a principal to meet all federal and local state deadlines. So much so that I think the major shift that we did was we changed the title to signify that. They used to be called cluster superintendents, at one point associate superintendents, and the title now is instructional superintendent to emphasize the focus on instruction.
That's great. Ben, Janiece, would you like to add?
And so when I was thinking about this question, I think about Heifetz-Linsky's, balcony and dance floor analogy. And I was thinking about, as a principal, and when I started out, I was a principal for over a decade. And when I started out, it was a waltz on the dance floor. And maybe I could get up on the balcony a little bit and maybe see and take and reflect on what I was doing, what I needed to work on. But right now, I feel like it's like a house party on that floor, and it's like people. And it's a cacophony. There's a lot of different music going on at the same time, and the principals are really challenged with a greater level of complexity than we've experienced at any other point in history. And so, I feel like my role as the instructional superintendent, principal supervisor, is to help the principal to be on that balcony for the principal, watching them on the dance floor, but then also maybe meeting them out in the lobby and saying, okay, where do you want me to be? Can I get down there on the dance floor with you and help you side by side, or can you come with me on the balcony and let's take a look at the bigger picture? And so, the complexities of the principalship really demands a new sort of leader to support that because they can't do it alone.
Well, I know Ben has something to say about this new role of leadership.
Yeah, I would just say that as much as we now expect principals to be great at developing teachers through ongoing feedback, their knowledge of instruction, and creating great systems of learning at their school, our principals need the same thing. And so the real focus of this role has to be a frequency of visiting with principals, just as Janiece described, of giving them frequent feedback, of modeling for them what the kinds of feedback, development, and learning structures can be effective for their teachers, and bring that to life.
Great. Thank you both, all three. So, Amanda, I'm going to circle back to you again. And I know you're supervising your instructional superintendents. How do they stay focused? We just heard Janiece talk about, all of the, responsibilities. How do they stay focused on instructional leadership? And is there some sort of relationship that has to take place with the principal supervisors and perhaps like an individual in charge of instruction, like chief academic officer at the district level?
Well, I think Janiece would argue that I demand it. Will agree with me, rather, in saying that I demand it. Even our work at the table, in my development of them, in our developing of each other, so much of what we do focuses on professional learning. Every week when we gather for our weekly superintendent meetings, we engage in the discussion of professional literature or of the watching and analysis of high-quality teaching. The focus really is on professional learning, on instruction in everything that we do. In fact, I'm reminded of our selection process of superintendents. In the past, candidates would come to the central office and engage in an interview with myself or some of our top principals, the chancellor, some of the chiefs, and that would be their opportunity for us to assess their instructional chops. And 2 years ago, we changed that process to now include a more authentic assessment of the skills that we want. So now we take our candidates who have made it to the final round to a school for the entire day, and they walk with me or someone else on our team through the classrooms. I'm looking to see what notes they take, what are they picking up on in our little hallway debrief, and then at the very end of that walkthrough, we engage in a conversation with that school's principal. And I want to assess their ability to have a productive conversation with a principal to see if, one, they were able to diagnose some issues and to sort of court out that course of action that I referred to prior. And then it's also an opportunity when the candidate leaves for me to get feedback from the principal. Is this someone, and this of course is a higher performing principal in our district, that you could see yourself learning with? Does this person have, what you need to help you be successful in your role as a school principal? So I would say that the focus is always on instruction, and I guess that's why, by having an interview, that process that requires individuals to go to the schools sends a powerful message to the candidate as well. It lets them know that this is not, some cushy central office job where you're just going to be pushing paper, but that Alexander expects you to be in the schools and to have your sleeves rolled up. I'm proud to say that my instructional superintendents are very well versed in instruction. They know the difference between an A book and an MN book, and that hump that second graders experience. And I think that's the shift.
That's great. Ben, I saw you shaking your head in the beginning here with Amanda's comments. What might you add?
Just the importance, and I think Amanda gave it very well, that across the curriculum and instruction office, if you have a large district, and then across the principal supervision, which we often see being in different teams, even if they eventually report up to one leader, having that very strong shared vision of what quality instruction is, I think is so crucial. What Amanda described as the systems to sit even at the principal supervisor level where you would assume this isn't needed, to sit together on a regular basis, look at instruction, talk about what quality instruction is, do walkthroughs of schools together, and then to know who has the rights and responsibilities to bring instructional resources to this school. So there are often multiple systems of professional developers, coaches, and others, being very clear as a system who directs those resources, how they can be gathered, what problems they can best be brought to solve between the principal supervisor team and the CNI team.
Janiece, would you like to?
I just wanted to share sort of an example of one of the things that, one of our priorities is helping principals to develop strong instructional leadership teams. So we started this year having bi-monthly professional development sessions that are for academic leadership teams, not just the principal. And every month, every time we have one of these sessions, I'm co-planning with the deputy chief in the Office of Teaching and Learning, because there's some things that, there are things that we need to be doing together to really move our system forward.
Great. Well, Janiece, hold that mic, because this is the holiday season, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to state your wishes. Serving as an instructional superintendent, what kind of support are you looking for from the district for, first of all, the role of instructional superintendent, or in generic, principal supervisors, and individually as a principal supervisor? What do you need?
Well, I can say that I wouldn't have made it without the professional development. I mean, I think that was the biggest key in really understanding what my job is. I think it's really important to I've come to realize that it's not about being super principal, and I think these standards really speak to that. It's not like I was a good principal in my own building, in my own context, but it's sort of how can I influence others to understand their own context, their local context, and also influence them to, towards increased student achievement. And so I think the professional development that we do on a weekly basis helps me to really take some time to reflect, to read the articles about the emerging role of the instructional superintendent, in addition to specific content area pieces. And it also gives me an opportunity to calibrate with the other job-alike partners. There are 9 of us in the district, and and work together with them to really solve some complex problems. We have problems of practice. We visit schools together, and I think that camaraderie was essential. I also want to shout out, there are a couple people here from Tulsa. We have visited them, they visited us, and shadowed us, and really given us some really excellent feedback. I mean, I don't think as a principal I got much feedback at all. And I feel that in my current role, I've gotten so much feedback about how I can get better in my practice that I have grown tremendously. So I think PD is the foundation.
What about span of control?
So I'm getting to that. So I feel very blessed to have a 1 to 12 ratio. I supervise 12 schools, and we each have between 12 and 14 schools. But the more that I learn about my job, the more that I feel that I'm doing better, the more I realize that I don't have enough time to do this, even with 12 leaders. Because some leaders require a lot more, and and they deserve more. And the more that I think the better that I get at my role, the more that I see that it would really be better to have fewer. And we've talked about this, boss.
Dear Santa.
Right, and it really is about span of control. So, I think the ratio is still a little high, but I think having a boss that sort of helps to move these other compliance things and say it's okay not to respond to that email about this because I want you in the schools, and I don't want you to focus on that. I mean, that's been very integral.
Great. Well, thanks, Janiece. I hope we didn't put you on the spot.
Block that out of the video.
But
block that piece out of the video.
Yeah.
oh, there you
I do
go.
respond to all emails.
There you
but
go. So, Ben and Amanda, do you want to say any more?
So I think you are hearing from both Janiece and Amanda a great vision of what the kinds of district supports for principal supervisors need to be and should be. I will say a flip side of that is unfortunately what we hear, having trained over 1,000 principals, over 50 of them now become principal supervisors in systems around the country. When we talk to them, when we survey them, the first thing they say is, no one told me what my job was when I got it. But they say something different then. But then I met all the other central office leaders. They all had an idea what my job was, to serve their needs and their time and their communication. So it's crucially important to use whether these standards or to adjust them for your own districts, to be very clear with folks in these roles about their priorities of time, what you expect of them, and especially being in schools, seeing the work of principals on the ground. That gets directly to the span of control issue. You can't do that. You can't know the context of a school and the practices of enough principals if you're managing more than 30, even more than 15, we would say. And then the other piece is, this is a role that still does need that ongoing professional learning that is all about the group learning you heard Janiece described. Working together on, do we see principal practice the same way? Do we see instruction the same way? How do we manage our time to do these things? And then the last thing that I would say is, as you develop this role, really think about, when do you need them to be central office leaders? That's time in committees, time in decision-making, time in other structures. And when are they really out in schools working as principal developers? And you want to really be careful about that ratio, because so many systems have built up a history that they are sort of central office committee members, firefighters, et cetera. So a couple of things to think about as a district supporting.
Great, thank you. Amanda, I don't know if you want to add or save it.
That they have definitely said it all. I really think that once you shift your thinking, then you need to organize around that. Janiece and I had a really good taxi cab conversation on the way over here as we are preparing to bring on board about 3 or 4 new superintendents next year, what are those skills and dispositions that are really needed? I mean, our thinking has evolved, mine in just the last 5 years. When I first became a principal supervisor, I was a really good principal at 2 schools, raised test scores, double digits. But in retrospect, I'm not sure if at the time I had all of the skills necessary to be a supervisor of principals. I'm fortunate that the diversity of my experiences between New York City public schools and Washington, D.C., gave me a lot of what I needed in the context of D.C.'s public schools. But it's a different skill set, and I think that would be the point that I'd want to drive home, that a good principal doesn't necessarily make a good supervisor of principals. A principal supervisor needs one, of course, to be really skilled in diagnosis, as I said before, but it's really about you modeling change, leading change, helping people get better at what they do. That's very different than you having had the skills in an individual school building to get that individual school to higher levels of performance.
Thanks, Amanda. We have about 10 minutes left for our discussion. So I'm going to go back to Janiece again, and I like putting Janiece on the spot because it's all about you today, Janiece.
Well, thank you.
I'm sure you don't get that all the time.
No.
So, but I guess I'd like to know, does the district's work change? And I think both Amanda and Ben have alluded to this already, but how do you see the district changing in their support to this new role of principal supervisor or instructional superintendent?
So I don't know if you can bring it back up, but that the standard 5, I think it was, whether we advocate for and inform the coherence of organizational vision, policies, and strategies to support schools and learning. Up there also is a standard 6. And then if you go to your next slide, I was thinking about standard 8. Leading strategic change. I feel like that is the area that we're working on as a district. People have to really understand what the new role of the instructional superintendent or principal supervisor is and buy into that vision. I feel like even since last year, our role is evolving and we're having more influence because people see that we can be key levers to school change. We are invited we're now going to be part of the vetting process for the budget, which was last year. It was, okay, here are the budgets. You just sign off on it, click this and say yes. And, if you have a question, you have like 12 hours to turn it around. And this year, I feel that we have been, sort of given a seat at the table for decision making. So I feel like the org chart has to change in terms of sort of how we interact with each other, not necessarily sort of the hierarchy of the org chart, but sort of how those arrows point to each other. And I feel that that's how we get a chance to influence the policies in our district. So. There is a lot of change still to be made on this front.
Oh, that's great, Janiece. And I think I'm going to jump to the next couple of questions because both Amanda and Ben will have time to respond to this question about district change as well in that. But clearly, this whole notion of principal supervisor is a work in progress right now, and it's a learning curve for both the principal supervisor and the district. So, Ben, I'm going to shift to you now, and you are working with many districts across the country. Does this role of principal supervisor play out the same in every district? And what does it mean in particular for smaller districts? We don't want small districts to just say, well, we don't have the capacity to do these standards. So what do you suggest? What do you do?
Yeah, I think we do see across the districts we're working with, once they come to this vision of a principal supervisor role and of the role of principal supervision to develop principals, Many of them are creating structures like you've heard about from DC, much lower ratios and roles that are quite dedicated to this kind of principal development. Some larger districts are still sort of keeping one role responsible for many principals, 30 to 50, but even in those cases, they generally have staff that are then getting into schools much more often, feeding into both the evaluation and the development of principals, and creating in those sort of more pyramid structures. I think the tougher questions are for small districts. And for them, I would think much more about reading this list of standards and thinking this isn't about one person or one person's role, but how do we accomplish all of these activities, especially the first four around building instructional leadership and developing principals. So whether that would be a superintendent talking to a chief academic officer, how are we going to split this time? Who's going to be in schools that frequently is one of the crucial questions to ask. Are there ways we can work with our regional centers or education service centers to bring principals together in professional learning to cover that part of that standard while we still go in and do some of the key one-on-one work to give feedback, to know what their needs are? I would think about it more reading through this and saying, how do we as a small team then accomplish this on behalf of our principals rather than a one new role to tackle in that place?
Great. And Amanda and Janiece, would you like to follow up with Ben? We're good. Okay. And Ben, another question. How do you use these principal supervisor standards as a lever for change in the district? And I'm not talking just about principal supervisor change, but also the work of principals and also the work of the district.
Yeah, I think the first thing to come to is to say, does the whole central office, not just sort of a chief of schools or head of school supervision, believe in something like this standards? I would want to see a whole central office team come together and say, do we believe in a vision at least like this, to write down and name, this is what we think this role looks like. And therefore, in some of the ways that both Janiece and Amanda spoke about, what does this mean for the rest of us? What does this mean for our academic and curriculum instruction team? How do we interact? How would the finance and HR teams interact with that? So there's a real agreement around the priorities of this role, where this role spends its time, and what that means. And so it's spending some real time revising these standards, adopting them how they want in their district, but as a whole district team. And then I think some other key things, as with any good set of educator standards, you go to some of the other activities Amanda spoke about. You're thinking about how do we then use this set of competencies or standards to decide who do we hire into these roles. And a lot of districts are now thinking at the forefront of this of how do we pick out which of those great principles, which as Amanda said isn't enough, do we think are going to be good high potential for this? And we talked about Tulsa earlier. They actually have put together a real program to think about for some of their best principals, how do they get them ready for these roles? How do they have them do walkthroughs together with others even before they're hiring for this role to get used to doing that, to leading professional development sessions for their peer principals, for thinking about and being engaged in some of those district strategy conversations where they've got to have a viewpoint beyond the school level and get used to what those decisions look like. And so you can use these standards to think about how do you identify future potential, help them develop, and then hire folks into that along the way.
Great. Amanda, Janiece, would you like to?
I agree. I think our next step in DCPS is to take these standards and engage the chancellor and the chiefs in a conversation, a deep dive about each of them. And I think that's, a good starting point for all districts, not necessarily that you will adopt each one in its entirety, but I think it makes for good conversation to take Standard 5, for example, which Janiece referred to previously, and engage in a conversation about that. I mean, for us in the district, I do think it's an area of growth. And for us to just have collaborative conversation and to sort of reach consensus on what this new role means, I think would be very powerful and directly influence our practices going forward.
Thank you.
And I think in our case, there are 9 of us in this role. So for me, I see this as sort of a way to help calibrate us across the district, even, at this point where, this is what this looks like, and maybe sort of building that out and saying, okay, what does this standard look like? in our everyday practice, and sort of coming up, with some ideas that we all are agree to. So it'll help us calibrate across the system.
Great. Thank you. I have one final question, and then we're going to open it up. And the question is this. So I'm a district, I'm a state, I'm intrigued by these standards, I'm going to go home and read them, but what happens after that? How do I get started? And I think, some of your conversation has already captured that, but what resources are available to folks? I know in the standards document itself, there's a section in the introduction called Using the Standards. And in that, there's some actual self-assessment questions for districts to use and states to use to determine their readiness for moving in this direction of shifting the role of principal supervisor. So we know that's one resource, but what else is out there?
Our district has partnered with NTC to engage, and I think it's been very powerful, to engage our superintendents in the blended coaching strategies. As I've said before, it's about coaching, mentoring, developing. It's not compliance. And we found our partnership with NTC, funded by Wallace, to be very beneficial to our work.
Great.
Yeah, I would point to a couple of resources about sort of structuring the role, structuring the central office. In particular, funded by the Wallace Foundation, great work from the University of Washington and their researchers around a whole set of papers on central office transformation that really focus on this role. And there's a whole toolkit, set of materials, and even a survey around their set of standards that principals can take and say, am I getting this kind of instructional leadership support? So those are a whole set of things that central office teams can use along the way, as well as a number of papers you can find at the Wallace Foundation and at the Gates Foundation on this role. The Gates Foundation paper on learning-centered leadership and a set of frameworks they've created around that. But then I do think the key piece is many districts that are doing this work, I think, at the forefront, have invested in partners who are helping this sort of ongoing learning, this crucial role of professional development of the principal supervisors themselves as a community of practice, and in doing their sort of coaching and feedback role. And again, would point, the Wallace Foundation has a set of providers that they are working with and have recommended to their districts. New Leaders is one, University of Washington, New Teachers Center, New York City Leadership Academy. There are a number of others doing that work. One plug I'll put in for ourselves is that we are working to bring that group of providers together. And so over the next year, we'll be doing some work as a group of providers together to think about how do we best serve the districts who are trying to get this role right. And so we'll be doing some writing and publishing out of that by next fall.
Great. Well, did you want, no. Okay. Okay, all right, very good. We'll hold that. You may get the first question, Amanda. So at this point, I have somebody waiting first in the queue to ask a question of our panelists or about the standards.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Kathy Cox with the Education Delivery Institute. I'm intrigued by what you said, that being a great principal doesn't necessarily prepare you for this. Excuse me. Have you ever thought about someone that's never been a principal, for instance, an excellent teacher leader, being a principal supervisor?
I don't think I've ever thought of that, to be honest, but it wouldn't be impossible. I mean, I could see how a great teacher leader could eventually become a great principal supervisor, but I think you have had to have lived that experience in order to even have street credibility with those who you supervise.
I could see the coaching aspect of my role being done by someone who really had a really great coaching background. I think the supervision, the actual evaluation part would be trickier if you've never been in the role, going back to what Amanda said about sort of that credibility and building relationships with the principals. It's really essential to be able to be effective with them. So, depends on the district and how they structure their roles.
All right, next question.
Good morning. My name is Kathy O'Neill. I'm an educational leadership researcher. And first of all, thank you for giving attention to a topic that's needed attention for a long time. I think it's wonderful. My question has to do with some of the research we've been doing, and that is, most of what you've addressed this morning has been assessment, growth and development and coaching, mentoring, supporting people. With the feeding frenzy that we see at some state levels as far as principal evaluation, I really would like to know how you marry the two, how you're able to be a relationship builder, a mentor, and a coach, and still be able, whatever it is in your systems that you're doing, to give valid evaluation to support the process.
Do we have a volunteer on the panel?
I'm glad you raised that question because that's a balance that we are working on right now. I mean, I think all of our principal supervisors in our district want to engage heavily on the coaching side of the work, but at the end of the day, they still are, a principal's evaluator. I think one of the things that we have done, which has made it, has allowed us all to be more transparent with principals and their performance, is to provide them with monthly written feedback. In the past, our principals would just receive feedback, formal feedback, 2 times per year, at the middle of the year and at the end of the year. Now, as a result of this new process, our principals receive feedback every month, and it's aligned to that mid-year and annual evaluation. The same standards that they're evaluated on mid-year and end of year are touched upon during this monthly feedback. So the form includes those 6 standards, and the principal supervisors provide a comment and some actionable next steps. And as a result, this year, I think we only had 1 principal challenge their final evaluation.
Great, thank you.
I think as we get deeper into the coaching work, I've sort of taken the tact of using the coaching work in the personal leadership aspect. We have 6 domains that we evaluate principals on, and so, the actual coaching, problem solving, I've sort of kind of left to one area, and then when we talk about sort of how does that personal leadership influence instruction, influence talent, et cetera, we really kind of go on the data through our evaluation system. So I try to balance it. It's tricky. It is something that we're continuing to work on. But I think if your principals trust you, then you can. It feels good to me right now. But I feel like I have a great relationship with my principals, and I think that's first and foremost before you try to wear those 2 hats.
Great. We have one last question and 1 last minute, so I'll have you ask your question.
Thank you. Jim Eicher with the British Columbia Teachers Federation. I find your work intriguing, and excuse my lack of knowledge in case my question is implicit in the work that you do, but in terms of your supervision and coaching, et cetera, that you're involved in, is there an expectation that your principals or your principal leaders or your superintendent people actually have to go back into the classroom and teach also?
No, there is not. There is not that expectation.
And have you thought about that piece in terms of being grounded back in the classroom?
I have not thought about that, but I will say that we try to stay close to teaching and learning as much as possible. That's what the weekly conversations are about. We are in school buildings, observing classes. We know many of our teachers in our clusters by names, and we, I think, try our best to stay close to the work.
Yeah, I would just say in the districts in which we are coaching and developing principal supervisors, because in this country so many places have gone through a significant change in student standards and therefore expectations around the approach and the quality of instruction, that's a very big part of our work. We're spending a lot of time looking at classroom practices, doing school walkthroughs together, excuse me, really talking about what is quality instruction, even if they're not going back to the classroom to teach, because many of them did not teach to those standards. The folks who are now serving as principal supervisors, and so they've got to get very familiar with that, have that very new and shared sense of what good instruction looks like.
So at this point, I would like to thank our panelists, so please join me in giving them a round of applause.